Hey there, it's Chris from the Conservation Cooperative. I've got a fun fish fact for you today. Did you know that brook trout holds the title for the most common state fish in the United States? That's right, 10 states have named brook trout as their official fish. And the next in line? Not even close. Largemouth bass coming in with just 5 states. Honestly, I think brookies are the perfect choice. Not only are they a stunning fish, but they also live in some of the most beautiful, pristine waters you'll ever find. Fly fishing writer and thinker extraordinaire John Gierak summed it up perfectly in his book Trout Bum when he wrote, "I used to think that when I caught a brook trout, I was touching one of God's better creations. And after years of contemplation, I haven't changed my mind." Despite all the honors and love this fish receives, the fact is, even brook trout get the blues, especially as they continue to get squeezed by shrinking habitats due to warming waters. Welcome to the Conservation Cooperative Podcast, a production of the New England and New York chapters of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Here, we dig a little deeper into the issues that are impacting our wild public lands, waters, and wildlife in the Northeast. Today, we're diving into the world of brook trout, how they're being affected by our changing climate, and what that means for the future. But before we get into that, let's take a moment to appreciate this incredible fish. If you're tuning in, there's a good chance brook trout hold a special place in your heart. And for good reason. They're beloved by many. But what you might not know is just how extraordinary they truly are. Ongoing research here in the Northeast is revealing some amazing insights into the resilience and adaptability of these remarkable fish.
Adam Kautza, I'm the Coldwater Fisheries project leader for MassWildlife. It's amazing where we find brook trout. I mean, the key is cold water. I mean, if you have cold water, they can deal with almost anything. I take volunteers out all the time and they're amazed at the places that we find brook trout. We were just in a stream in Berlin the other day where there was just like a trickle of water, a few shallow, mucky pools. And I was like, there's definitely going to be brook trout in here. It's cold. And they're like, no, there's not going to be anything in here. It just looked terrible. And yeah, we found like in 100-meter section, we found 37 brook trout, of multiple age classes. They can deal with a lot of things.
How about this? A section of stream in southern New England that's been thriving for hundreds of generations, despite being completely cut off from any other fish coming into the system.
There's one little tributary in this study area that's behind a waterfall. And the population of fish there has been isolated for a really long time. And in fact, they have so little genetic variability that we couldn't do the pedigree reconstruction, it's called. So basically, look at the family tree.
That's Ben Letcher, by the way. He's a population and stream ecologist for the USGS's Eastern Ecological Science Center.
So there wasn't enough genetic variability to look at this one place. And we know from the genetic markers that we had that this population had been isolated for about 900 years or so. And the cool thing is, this was kind of a live fast, die young population. So they're stuck behind this waterfall. Very few of them actually go out. Some do, but very few go out. And so there's just this tiny little isolated population. And according to all the theory, with the amount of that low amount of genetic variability, this population shouldn't even be there. So this is one crazy thing about brook trout that we don't really understand is how can they persist in these tiny, tiny little populations? They seem to break all the rules.
Okay, one more, and this is incredible. Ben Letcher again.
We tagged a whole bunch of fish, but we also went out every season, so 4 times a year. And that's turned out to be really, really fascinating. Critical to our understanding is to be able to divide up what happens in each season. So, for example, in this stream system, 70% of the yearly growth happens in the spring. And they're growing almost 1 millimeter a day in the spring, which is insane. That's bluefish level growth. So you don't think of that, with trout, but it feels like you can almost hear them stretching. They're growing so fast. So they compress their growth into the spring, at least up here in New England. And that seems to be common in other places we've done some shorter term studies, and other people will look a little bit too. Just this crazy growth in the spring.
Let's get back on track and to the core theme of this episode: how brook trout are being impacted by a changing climate. It's important to note, though, that brook trout habitat is being degraded by a bunch of different factors, not just climate change. Pollution, land conversion, invasive species, poorly designed culverts, degradation of the riparian zone. The list goes on and on. In a lot of ways, brook trout are indicator species of the very highest water quality. As we've already heard, cold water is key, ideally between 12 and 19 degrees Celsius, or say 53 and 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Above that, and their ability to thrive and survive is significantly compromised. Already, populations of wild reproducing brook trout have been widely reduced in the Northeast, especially in southern New England and New York, with most being found in headwater streams. Finding natural and self-sustaining populations of brook trout in still waters, lakes and ponds, is becoming increasingly rare. Northern Maine, as well as the Adirondacks in New York, still have some impressive fisheries, but like everywhere else, the long-term viability is under threat.
My name is Stephen Jane. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Notre Dame. I do research on lake ecosystems and how they're responding to large-scale environmental change, and that includes, of course, climate change. The way brook trout fit into my work is I've done work in the Adirondacks looking at how changes in lake oxythermal habitat will likely affect brook trout, specifically related to the combination of warming and something called browning, which people that are familiar with the Adirondacks might be familiar with.
What's browning? It's a phenomenon where the lake's water becomes increasingly brown in color due to a rise in dissolved organic matter which runs into the lake. This material is mostly composed of decomposed plant material. It darkens the water, absorbs light, which in turn causes the surface water to warm. It also limits the penetration of sunlight, so the vast majority of the oxygen-producing photosynthetic activity takes place near the surface. The Adirondacks are vulnerable to lake browning, the result of the region's long history of being impacted by acid rain. Although air quality standards have dramatically reduced the problem, the area's unique soil characteristics and a century of being hit hard by acid rain makes the lake susceptible to browning, which has led some bodies of water to become highly stratified. Basically, a warm layer of water sitting atop a layer of cooler water below. So how does this all impact brook trout? I'll let Stephen explain.
And so you can think about, like, when a lake stratifies, the water in those deep layers has a set amount of oxygen, and then it slowly begins to decline at somewhat of a fixed rate as long as the lake remains stratified. And so the longer the lake is stratified, the less oxygen there will be by the end of the summer, all else being equal. And so we know that this situation is happening. So my thinking was that browning could potentially benefit or mitigate the effects of warming because it's increasing this volume of cool water. But what we find is that in most cases, it's going to exacerbate the effects of warming, because basically what happens is you get an increased spread of deoxygenated water from them. So you're getting two things happening: that longer time during the summer when that oxygen is drawing down, but also an increased spread of that low oxygen water from the bottom as you brown. So it's sort of a double whammy.
In effect, that double whammy is squeezing the habitat suitable for brook trout. Imagine a brook trout in one of these lakes impacted by browning. The water above it, though oxygenated, is way too warm. The water below the fish, though cool, doesn't carry an adequate amount of oxygen. With longer and warmer summers, and lakes and ponds remaining stratified like this longer, the band of suitable habitat within the lakes get narrower and narrower. An oxythermal squeeze, if you will. While a postdoc fellow at Cornell, Jane and his colleagues published a study in early 2024 that examined browning in Adirondack lakes. They placed sensors in 15 lakes, which recorded hourly data from June through mid-October in an effort to understand the dissolved oxygen and temperature through each lake's water column. In addition, they examined historical data which provided insights into the rate of browning. Using their statistical findings, they assessed the future ability of over 1,400 lakes to support brook trout. The outlook was not great.
It's a heads up, and it's not saying that all lakes are going to completely lose all of their habitat, but it's a general trajectory of reduced habitat through time. I think it gives more of a reason to be vigilant about not throwing brook or smallmouth bass into all of these lakes that don't have them. It's my hope that at some point there will be a handle on this issue. Acid rain was, I don't know when lakes started losing fish populations and all that kind of thing, but there was a good period of time and it returned. It demonstrates that things can come back from some pretty severe degradation. And on top of that, there is uncertainty. We don't know for certain how long browning is going to continue at the pace it's going on right now. And I don't personally think that brook trout are going to disappear from the Adirondacks altogether. It's just my hope that this doesn't cause people to completely write off brook trout.
While no one is writing off brook trout yet, this study has caught the attention of New York's Department of Environmental Conservation, especially as they look to update the brook trout management plan for the Adirondack region. More on that later. Remember Ben Letcher, the USGS scientist with those amazing brook trout facts? His work on brook trout is a little bit different. Rather than focusing on the dynamics of a lake system, Letcher and colleagues are looking at individual fish over time.
There's a study we've done since 1997 in Whately, Massachusetts, which is pretty close to UMass by Amherst, Massachusetts. And we tagged 30 or 40,000 brook trout, brown trout, and Atlantic salmon actually in the beginning, and followed them around for basically their whole lives, and learned about how individuals sort of behave, how they interact with each other, and how they contribute, how individual variation contributes to population. And brook trout are amazing because their numbers are all over the place. One year there'll be a huge cohort, the next year there'll be nothing. So that's really the question, is where does that variability come from? And by tagging individuals and following individuals around, we can really not only look at the reproductive success of individuals, but we can understand how environmental drivers like variation in stream temperature and stream flow influence population dynamics. And the way the individuals play into that is, so population dynamics is the sum of all the individuals. If we can understand what the individuals are in that population are doing and how they survive and how they grow, then we can kind of add those up and get to the population. So basically we have these, medical and location histories of individual fish. And when you do that, then you can estimate body growth. So how fast are they growing, and survival. And those two things, in addition to location, like where the fish is, plus reproductive success, gets you pretty much the whole picture of demography, which, population dynamics. And so that's what we've been after for a long time. A big chunk of what we do is trying to understand the drivers in a very detailed way of population dynamics.
As you can probably imagine, this is a big effort. Lots of fish being tagged, and you need to conduct seasonal surveys. Most commonly, researchers conduct what's known as an occupancy analysis. In that approach, you're trying to determine the probability that a fish will be in a given body of water. You do this by collecting data on where fish are or aren't, and then correlating that with various environmental variables. But in this case, Letcher and colleagues are focusing on individuals and following them over time and space, which helps to paint a picture of what's driving the rise and fall of a population. For example, remember that population of trout that have been isolated for 900 years? By tracking the individuals there, distinct differences from other populations began to emerge.
Yeah, so generation time, depending on exactly where you look, is about 1.5 years. And in this little isolated population, it's actually faster than other places. So this is the sort of live fast, die young. So they don't live much beyond 3 years. They don't get very big, but they reproduce earlier. And that maybe is also part of the equation, because in the world of demography, the best way to increase population growth is to reproduce earlier. So maybe that's the strategy.
Brook trout aren't just losing habitat in lakes and ponds. They're also feeling the squeeze in rivers and streams. This phenomenon, often called the climate squeeze, happens as downstream waters warm while upstream flow patterns become increasingly unpredictable due to more frequent floods and droughts. In the area where Letcher has been working, average summer water temperatures have risen by 1.5 degrees Celsius, around 3 degrees Fahrenheit, in just 15 years. That's a significant increase. What's even more surprising is the dramatic impact this temperature change has had on fish.
We know from a whole bunch of lab studies that growth rate is temperature dependent. We also know from some of these field studies that it's temperature dependent, but in kind of a complicated way. So growth rate will go up with temperature, increase kind of exponentially, then it'll level off, then it'll drop off pretty quickly. So we think of that as a growth performance curve. So growth is a function of temperature. So understanding sort of where on the temperature scale that growth performance curve is really, really important to understanding what's going to happen in the future with body size of fish. So there's a whole bunch of literature, scientific literature, about what's going to happen with fish in the ocean, coral reef fish and other fish. And almost every study there talks about, as temperatures increase, body sizes are going to decrease. And that's a huge concern, of course, for fisheries. The fascinating thing here is that with these cold water fish in the cooler streams, we're actually climbing that growth performance curve still. So it hasn't gotten too warm yet in the cooler streams. So in this particular stream that I've been talking about that we studied for a long time, it's a cool stream. So as it increased, as the stream temperature increased 1.5 degrees over those 15 years, the fish actually got bigger. And they got bigger by 20 or 30 millimeters, which is quite a bit.
So again, back to the value of tracking individuals. Letcher and his team can parse out the effects of different factors. So what did they conclude?
And really, temperature was the main driver for the increase in body size. And that's fascinating because it goes counter to what almost all the other studies are saying.
Remember back to the beginning of the episode where you heard Ben discuss the crazy growth in spring? Well, he believes it's due to the increased warming and where these fish are on that growth performance curve.
So it is strange that they don't grow so much in the summer or the fall. So they're making some kind of evolutionary ecological decision to put off some of that growth. And probably because it's risky to be out there in the fall. There's lots of birds, lots of raccoons and mink and other things that like to eat these fish. And then the other interesting thing is that the young of the year, the newborns that emerge in the spring, they actually grow in the fall. Whereas the older fish don't grow in the fall. They just kind of hunker down. They say, I've done my growing. I'm going to save my energy. I'm going to try to live as long as I can so I can reproduce.
Stephen Jane and Brian Letcher would be the first to tell you that there's a lot of exciting brook trout research happening right now. This is crucial, as many state agencies are in the process of updating trout management plans, some of which haven't been revised in decades. In other cases, states are considering adjusting regulations related to trout. In part 2 of this episode, we'll talk with representatives from state fish and wildlife agencies across the Northeast to hear firsthand how they're addressing these changes in light of climate change and the latest research. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I really, really hope that you learned something and are walking away with a greater appreciation for brook trout. If you want to engage on policy issues related to what we've talked about today, or involved with habitat stewardship projects that benefit brookies and other species, please become a member today. Don't forget to follow the New York and New England chapters on their respective social media accounts. Both chapters have a bunch of great stuff coming up on the calendar. We'd love to see you. All right, we'll catch you soon with part 2. Take care.